Hello, welcome to the 15-Minute Hour. This is Corey. Today we have a returning guest, Jonathan, from the podcast on Riding the Tiger and other such related works. And today we're talking about hierarchy and going beyond good and evil. I'm drinking the Lacrima wine that we had a few podcasts ago. And Calvin, let's see, you have coffee. Jonathan has coffee and water. And Seraphim has the Lacrima wine. And coffee.
Well, today I guess we're going to be talking about morals, right? Is that correct?
Yes, and the illusion of morality.
It's a fascinating topic, and one that is going to, as I told Corey before this, we might just irritate the world with this one. But I'll start out with we were talking about before the podcast about this idea that Augustine talks about.
Augustine, yeah.
And Jung says this is what disproves Plotinus, the idea that all evil is a place where there's no good. And I thought about that a lot, what that could mean. And when you read Plotinus further, you realize what he's talking about is there's only two, in Plotinus' world, there's only two aspects to reality. That which comes from above, the spirit, and then below, material realm. So if all there is if the spirit is not there at all, in any case, then all there is the material realm, which is just the land of effects, which would be, minus any good in the world, as good as he sees it as the sun and the one. And I told you, I've spoken before about my favorite Plotinus quote is that the goal of man is not to be a good man, but to become a god. And then you extrapolate that out further. And I'm sure you can add on to this with Plato. But if that's true, then what is morality?
Yes, and I think Plato leads here, if especially in dialogues like the Euthyphro, which have thrown theologians in loops for centuries. And I don't think the West has really ever solved this problem. And basically, so the eponymous dilemma that comes from that dialogue, you have Euthyphro saying, oh, I know what piety is. And of course, Socrates challenges him. And basically the center gear of that dialogue is where Socrates asks, is what is pious or good because the gods like it? Or do the gods simply will what is pious? And again, I think in the West, what you see develop is basically this Islamic position. I think the West and Islam is pretty similar on the response here, which is volitional theology. And different theologies in the West respond to this in different ways, but they really go back to the same root here, which is that what is good is simply what God wills. Now, the criticism here is that this is arbitrary. It makes morality arbitrary. I think no matter what you do, whether morality is what God wills or what God's like or some other option, or you just take an atheistic scientific route and it's all just neurochemistry, comes about through evolution. I think no matter what, any sense of morality is going to be arbitrary. So I tend to throw that criticism out the door. Now, what I do think is problematic nonetheless, theologically and philosophically, is that you have a state where there's no intuition between the experiential life of how to live and how to cultivate virtue and the object of worship, in this case, the God, in which that is in respect to. So I think, like, for instance, a lot of people, when faced against Calvinism, their primary objection is that that would be an evil God, so I'm not going to worship it. So there seems to be some level of natural intuition that people have, that there is some validity in saying we should have an idea about how the goodness that we have an intuition about is in relation to God. But you also don't want to carry that too far, because then you lead to this sort of saccharine immediacy of one's emotions and feelings and how that correlates to the divine morality. And I think there's an important aspect in which divinity should be otherworldly and, in lack of a better word, Lovecraftian, and it should be terrifying. But at the same time, you don't want to go on the other extreme route where it's totally abstract, like with Calvinism. Gregory Nietzsche talks about the analogy of sort of like you're painting, you're a skilled artist, and it's not until you've mastered that skill, that techne, that you can really judge great works that are not simply great because history has deemed them so, but they're great because they have a high level of skill. Like everyone will say, Da Vinci's a good artist or Picasso's a good artist or whatever, but only someone who's really practiced the techne of art can look at those paintings and say, this artist is actually great. It's not merely someone loved by history and people. So Gregory's point is that in the same way, only men of aristocracy of the soul, men who have actual virtue, can actually understand the virtue of the divine and how that relates. So it's kind of an intuitive bridge, but it's an intuition that's only accessible through accessing one's freedom, which is a heroic act.
Well, I'm going to complicate things, or maybe simplify them a little bit, bring in some Evola. So according to Evola, per his interpretation of Plotinus, anything that has a sentimentality to it, so right or wrong, good or bad, it has a thickness to it, if you know what I mean. Like it has a aura around it. It's completely wrong and absurd. There's only cause and effect. That's it. In the subtle realms, you create an action, the action will have an effect. That's all there is. And he talks about masturbation. He says people can masturbate all they want. That's no problem. That's fine. It shouldn't bother you at all. If that's how someone wants to waste all their life energy, if that's how they want to disconnect themselves from the sublime, that's fine.
This is Evola?
Yeah. He's like, if that's what they want to do, that's completely fine. That's their choice. There is no moral judgment. If that's how they wish to waste their life away, let them waste their life away. And he talks about how that everything from a traditional perspective is a law from God. It has no humanistic quality. Mm-hmm. It may not make sense to the human rationale, the human emotion. It's a law from God, back in tradition. And as traditions have gotten further and further away from God, what's happened is these religions have come up and they've tried to take these cause and effect rules, make them emotional.
Yes.
And democratize them across a level playing field. And these become the morals of each religion. Yep. And as the farther we get from the traditional, like let's say, for example, the Egyptians, the farther we get from the traditional rule of God, the more humanistic the morals become, and they just get stupider and stupider and stupider.
You go from virtue and arete to moralism.
Yeah. And Evola says whenever you have the thickness around a moral, it's wrong. Mm-hmm. And that's a strange thing to think about, because as a kid, I remember as I grew up in a Pentecostal church, and they would play these movies like A Thief in the Night and Heaven's Gate, Hell's Flame, like the rapture's going to happen any second, and so you would do something like I'm in puberty and 13 years old and you masturbate. You sit there and pray for 30 minutes later because you're afraid you're going to, I remember I would call 3 Christians I knew to make sure the rapture hadn't happened. I was terrified of this. And there was this like almost organic thickness around this whole thing, this right and wrong, just like, I can't describe a better way to put it. There's just a thickness, like a emotionality around all of this. But what Neville would say is that that's wrong. It's cause and effect. It's just cause and effect. That's it. And Gurdjieff would say, we have these 3 brains in our body, which he called, his terminology is so strange. Same idea though, is that you have to blend them into one. And once you blend them into one, you can see the true rationale of cause and effect.
Are the 3 brains the stomach, the heart, and the mind?
It's the solar plexus, the spine, and the brain.
Okay, interesting.
So the brain would be positive, spine's negative, solar plexus is neutral force with Gurdjieff. It's strange, but it all blends together.
Yeah, that sounds a bit Hindu. It sounds, I guess I could see that. The other aspect here that I think is interesting, I think, again, I was saying this earlier, and I'll repeat this from what I was saying before, but I think you read something like Nietzsche, Beyond Good and Evil, or Genealogy of Morals, and what the impression I have is that Nietzsche is responding to basically a dead Christianity. He's responding to a Protestant Christianity, the sort of womanish Christianity he was raised around with, and I think is entirely correct, which is that it is a moralism. And if you look at the Old Testament, I think it pretty quickly discards this image. A very literal reading, for example, Isaiah 45:7, I am the Lord your God. I create darkness and light. I create good and evil. Now, a lot of modern Christian interpreters try to get around this by saying, well, evil just means, like misfortune or something. It doesn't mean like moral evil. But there's still in that dichotomy working conceptually moralism. And I think the deeper aspect here is that good and evil are not really something that operate on the divine level. They are something that humans give names to, energies that come out directly or indirectly by God. They're basically names. And if you look into Dionysius the Areopagite, this is basically anything for God is just a name, and nothing you're doing when you're talking about God has anything to do with God whatsoever. We say God is all-knowing, God is good, whatever. Well, it's basically just emptiness. God is nothing. He, as the Psalms say, makes the clouds of darkness his secret hiding place. So what you're really looking at when we're talking about good and evil, even in the traditional sense of Christianity, theologically speaking, really has nothing to do with the level of the divine. It's merely, as Nietzsche would say, how we operate in power dynamics. And when Nietzsche's looking at things etymologically to understand the roots of words, for instance, noble or nobility, and understanding, a villain, it's just a villager, a common person, we start to see that there's actually foundationally, etymologically, at its root, a system of power and a system of caste that operates in any moralism. And the purpose morality really serves for most of history is an understanding of who operates at a higher aristocratic level and who operates at a lower level. It's only, I think, in around the time of the Enlightenment and modernity, especially starting with Catholicism in the medieval times, that you start to see morality shift from a utility of power to something that has to deal with ontology. And I think that's a huge mistake. And I think that's one of the pivotal mistakes that lead us to where we are now. But I think, Jonathan, you also wanted to speak on this relationship between the caste and the hierarchy and power and morality.
Well, this is when it gets real controversial. Evelyn saw it as in no way, shape, or form is there a democratized, universal right and wrong or cause and effect for everyone. It was all caste.
Yes.
And so you have, let's just say, theoretically 5 castes. And Evelyn thought, if you really want to know what caste you're in, play around with cause and effect and see what you get away with. And the higher the caste, it's going to be different actions will lead to different effects. It will be less terrible on you.
Less terrible on the conscience?
No, and there's no conscience.
It's just immediate.
Not necessarily immediate, but just, okay, for example, let's say you have a guy who goes out and he steals a car, right? Then the next day, a drug dealer goes wrong, drug deal goes wrong, he gets shot in the stomach, goes to the hospital. Well, in modern terms, we say that's karma. I would say, no, that's cause and effect. He broke the cause and effect of his caste. That's what he did. He broke that law, and because of that, he has to pay the repercussions of that. And let's say then you go to someone like Attila the Hun. Now, Attila the Hun conquered and stole and raped and pillaged and everything.
Yeah.
And seemed to have no repercussion from it. Well, let's say because he's from a higher caste.
I see. Now, a base reading of this, which isn't to say by any means what Evelyn's actual meaning here is that people who sort of are just very lucky in the view of the common man and getting away with a lot of evil, they are actually true aristocrats. Is that always the case, or is this only sometimes the case? Or does Evelyn have any nuance here?
Not really.
Okay.
It's you can't for one thing, you can't look at society today and say the upper class or higher caste.
Of course.
That's absurd.
Right. If anything, it's the inverse.
He says it's the inverse, but regardless, it's absurd to him. His whole thing is just, this is this one chapter in the 2nd volume of his book of magic. He goes into this that, because it's all these books in this books of magic are just practical exercises. And this particular exercise is play around with cause and effect in the subtle world. Like, see what you can get away with, see what the repercussions are for different things. I'll give you an example that's happened recently. This is something I'm so embarrassed about. I can't even want to talk about it. It's so embarrassing. So I'm leaving work at the parking garage, right? And I know this. One thing I've known about myself since I was a child is I cannot steal or take what's not mine whatsoever for any reason. I will get paid back tenfold. I cannot. There's other things I know I can get away with, but that's one I cannot. So I'm leaving the parking garage. And as I'm going out, there's like $16 sitting there coming out of the meter. I didn't even think anything about it. Gurdjieff would say I was asleep. I was like, took that, paid my parking meter with it, drove on. I mean, I didn't even think about it. Well, the next 3 days of work, I have the worst 3 shifts I've ever had. And it hit me on the third day like, oh my God, this is the effect of that action. So in order to break the juju, I don't know, it seemed to work. That night when I was leaving the parking garage, I think I got $16 out of originally. I put $30 on top there. It's like, here, sorry, I'm out. And eventually the thing broke. I don't know if that was what broke it. That's probably just stupid superstition. But I was trying to find a way to get out of this. But this is an example of what he's talking about there's a action and then there's an effect of the action.
Yeah, that's interesting. You do it almost twicefold. But even Jesus, when he meets Zacharias, he has Zacharias pay back fourfold what he took away. So I think even, I don't think it is merely superstition. There's definitely some aspect of twofold and fourfold numerology in how one redistributes their, for lack of a better word, karma, as much as that word's been tainted by New Age thought. Yeah. There's something going on there, though, mathematically, in a spiritual sense.
That is interesting. I hadn't thought of it like that. I just thought I'd just double whatever I did, Let's get rid of this. And it was so stupid, because I know I've known in the past, I've gotten away with a lot of things that would be deemed terrible, but that stealing is something I've never been able to get away with. Even if it's something that is dumb and meaningless as taking some money that somebody left there, I knew I would have known that if I just would have been awake and thought about what I was doing, that I'm not going to get away with this.
So would it be overly simplistic to say the more you end up getting away with without any retribution, the higher your caste is?
I don't want to say yes.
An immediate reading of something like Nietzsche, I think, implies this.
That's what Evelyn implies too. I mean, it's he talks about if you want to know your case, see what you can get away with.
It's not even a philosophical mode of being. It's a poetic, spiritual state of being where you sort of thus spoke Zarathustra. You merely go out in the world and do what you do, and that itself creates a way of life for other people. And you generally never get philosophers who reach that state aside from someone like Socrates, where their very way of life is their philosophy. And that way of life actually creates Western civilization.
Yeah, and that's, Evel talks about that. I mean, on the personal level, then he saw cause and effect in caste as helping everyone, including the lowest caste, because it helps them it puts them in line with the divine will. Yes. And no matter what, because he doesn't see anything with this material realm being special or important at all. So if a person's wealthy or poor means nothing to Evola, but just the simple fact of find your case, put yourself in line with the case, you'll align yourself with the one, you can find your true will in life.
Now, does Evola say something along the lines that there are actually more responsibilities for the people of the higher case? For instance, I would imagine intuitively that someone who's of the lowest caste, just going about spilling their seed haphazardly, would actually suffer less than someone of a Brahmin case doing so.
Yeah, he implies that. So
they're actually, in a certain sense, again, the simplistic reading is that you have more moral freedom or beyond moral freedom as someone of a higher case. But in some senses, that power actually has more responsibility.
And it's almost like it's reversed. Mm-hmm. Whereas someone, let's say in the lower case, could not be punished for spilling their seed. Someone in the higher case would be punished. It's almost like it's just reversed.
Yes.
That's how it reads, at least. And
I was going to say, you hear these sort of adages that come out of Hinduism, like the king who humiliates himself to shuffle shit is actually committing a much greater sin than the have-not or who's supposed to be shoveling shit going out to do mercantile work. Yeah. It's actually a greater sin to step down from your position to go to a lower state than it is to try to violate your lower state to a higher one.
That's fascinating. It makes a lot of sense, though.
And Plato talks about this in Republic too, where the sort of unfortunate aspect of human psychology in the city is that philosophers are never kings. And philosophers are sort of in this perpetual state of doing violence to themselves because they're not kings. And kings who are not philosophers are doing violence to themselves on the principle of not being philosophers. And most people, I think this applies more so than anything nowadays with democracy, are doing an intense violence to their soul by even thinking about politics, because that's something only a philosopher is supposed to really be doing.
Yeah, well, in politics, it's become so mundane, dumbed down, and worthless, it's almost like there's no point.
Well, it's just tribalism, basically.
Yeah, discuss anything.
We talked about this in another podcast. Politics is basically a fashion statement.
Oh, yeah.
It has nothing. Most 99% of people you talk to about politics, they aren't making a political statement. They're making a aesthetic judgment.
That's a good point. It's almost like in the 90s, they chose whether they're going to be emo or grunge.
Right,
or
exactly, yes.
The same kind of thing, yeah.
Political stances are a clique. A clique? Is that the word? A clique, yeah. They're a clique, yeah.
Reminds me of something I was telling my dad over Christmas. He was arguing about he's a Republican. It's funny, he's become more so as he's gotten older. I'm sure that's just a reflection of what's going on in the culture. But anyway, I said, Dad, haven't you figured this out yet? They're both going in the same direction. One just lays on the gas more, the other one lays on the brakes more, but they're both, aiming at the same exact direction. There's no difference. It's a joke to get upset about it,
Yeah, which I've always said, like, insofar you have modern political structures, conservatism was always seemed like the much more stupider, feudal version, because it's, like you said, they're going the same direction. Calvin, yes,
I did have one question about the morality of this, and this can go to both of you, and just kind of your own opinion on it. Do you think it would be bad if it is a fashion statement to change what you say you are based on who you're with? Like you would wear different clothes at a different social setting. Do you think it's bad to kind of change what you say your political party identification is based on who you're around or what setting you're in?
That's an interesting question.
According to Gurdjieff, absolutely not. And Gurdjieff did this all the time. I mean, his entire life is blending.
That's paleogenesis, right? Hiding the identity. Yeah.
That's what he does, and that's his entire work. Is it over here? When he goes to Pakistan, he's a carpet salesman, and he's big with the sheep herders and the shepherds and all those. And then he goes over to France, and he's this moralist, and he loves fine wines and loves fine venison, and he does this his entire life. And I think it'd be fine to do that. It's about lowering yourself. That's more of a horizontal jump than some kind of vertical,
I would say, I think even if you want to respond to this in the negative, that you should have some level of integrity. Nonetheless, to the degree to which the ancient wisdoms, including Jesus himself, says not to cast your pearls before swine,
it's a great quote,
is so intense, especially nowadays, that the level to which you have to hide the secrets of actual truth, if you actually think about these things, which is to say, I guess I'm not responding to this question for the majority of people, but for those who are of this nature, the level to which you have to do that, you may as well be changing the clothes you wear, because what you are revealing about the hidden knowledge in these things is of such a great nature. You basically appear as totally someone else. I think what you would see is someone like Gurdjieff here, who's basically just pretending to be the common man and not really having any opinion. Sort of like when Anthony the Great is looking for the saint greater than him, and he runs into, of all people, some poor cobbler in the middle of the city when he's out in the desert. And God says, this cobbler is holier than you. And he asks the cobbler, what is your theology? And the cobbler's like, oh, I don't know. I just make shoes. And every time a person passes me, I know that they are saved, and only I am damned. And so there's a sense in which that aspect of humility is really just a pouring forth of the understanding that there's something that has to be contained. Coal only becomes diamond under intense darkness for a very long period of time. So the inner work that you're doing spiritually, alchemically, has to be hidden from the masses. And only in very correctly judged states do you let a bit of that outside. If you read Symposium by Plato, right at the end, Alcibiades gives that wonderful speech where he's saying that Socrates actually is, despite being such an ugly, mofo, he has this beautiful state of his soul on the inside, but he only reveals it in very small glimpses. And so the inner work is something that is a treasure, and the treasure that is hidden shines all the more brightly.
Well, I think with Gurdjieff, it's going to break so many taboos. Mm-hmm. He sees everyone as complete idiots.
Well, no, I think that's totally fine. Yeah.
He's just having fun. I mean, when you read his books, he's just having fun with them. He's just giving himself something to do by making these guys look like clowns, but being a clown himself, and he only reveals wisdom to his inner circle. Yeah. And everyone else is just he does some things that are morally reprehensible to modern man. He rips people off all the time, because he judges them kind of. He talks about this woman would come up to him and she's, bitching at him, and he decides then and there, he realizes this is a terrible person. I'm gonna rip her off. So he rips her off, and he just has fun with everyone, unless they show a certain sense of dignity. he doesn't show them any. So he doesn't mind being a chameleon because he didn't care about
Yeah.
them, doesn't care what happens to them. He's just having fun. That's how his book reads. It's just,
Yeah.
you know, they want me to be this, I'm going to be this. And it's kind of, I don't know. And Gurdjieff is very confusing. I'm not saying he's right or wrong. It's nonetheless interesting. But Evola recommended Gurdjieff to people, and they were in the same time frame. So Crawley, at one point, you've heard this story, goes into Gurdjieff's Fountain Blue to get help for his heroin addiction, and Gurdjieff tells him to get out, you nasty man, you know?
Yeah.
So I don't know. But yeah, I don't think it matters. At least the pearls before swine thing, I think about all the time. And one of my biggest mistakes, I think, was telling people who didn't deserve it about the semen retention. I've scolded myself for this.
You mean on the podcast?
No, that's fine.
Oh, just in general.
People listen to your podcast are probably worthy, just is a general statement, you know. I'm talking about like at work. It came up one day, right? And these idiots mocking and like, ha, ha, ha. And I realized like, yeah, there's absolutely no point to cast pearls before swine. Like a chef got sick for like the umpteenth time. I'm like, bro, you masturbate too much, man. I'm going to go ahead and tell you that right now. It's your problem. And so it kind of came out about me. And so like, but you realize like, yeah, they have no right to know any of this stuff. Yeah. None. Like, what's the point? You're like an idiot is all that happens. And I think that's why it breaks some kind of cause and effect. I don't know. I don't know. It seems like that's why you don't cast pearls before swine, because it gets misinterpreted, it gets misunderstood, or it just gets completely ignored.
There's an art to this esoteric practice, which I think Jesus was really the master of, where you do speak truths, but you speak it in parables.
Yeah.
And when the apostles asked Jesus why he does this, he specifically says, because I can't let these idiots knowing what I'm actually saying. If they understood what I was actually saying, they'd be damned all the more. Like, I have to say what I say in parables, so those who have ears to hear will hear. But the vast majority are just, you know, not even. It goes beyond intelligence in the sense of stupidity. It's a spiritual darkness. It's a spiritual stupidity. 100%. And you could be a total, you know, what we'd be called clinical retarded and have an intense spiritual acumen.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And vice versa. In fact, I think there's a danger zone around. I think once you go past 125 IQ, you get into this danger zone of being a spiritual idiot. And I think a lot of very intelligent people, especially college-educated people, because it's such a propaganda machine, are some of the most spiritually idiotic people I've ever known. And Pascal and Demetre both say that in many times throughout history, it's the common idiot, village idiot, who has more wisdom, spiritual wisdom, than, you know, the people in academies or priests or so-called Brahmin case, right? And that's just an aspect of living in the Kali Yuga, you know, that it's inverse.
What's Ken Wheeler call those? Overly intelligent fools.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. The people that come out of universities. And it's what I was telling you earlier about the horizontal knowledge. I think that's all that is that you gain more horizontal knowledge without gaining any depth on the vertical, you know, of what a thing means. And that's, people read so many books, and I've been guilty of this. You read as many, like, I read 65 books this year, you know, but you've gained nothing. You just keep going across the horizontal plane and not moving anywhere. Yeah,
and we were speaking this before the podcast, but there's an art to reading in of itself, like Nietzsche says, where you don't read at specific times. You don't read in the morning, you read in the evening, or a lot of these artists or creative types, you know, doing all their work at 4 or 5 a.m. There's a schedule to which you have to operate yourself fasting, not merely of sustenance, of physical sustenance, but even literary sustenance, because you need your mind to cultivate and experience. I mean, the big problem, you know, Jadot, the French philosopher, points this out, is that the whole demise of the West can really be traced to the separation between action and thought. You know, again, going back to the master of Socrates, or someone like Jesus or the Buddha, whose entire philosophy is the way they act. We start to dwell, especially with scholasticism in the West, to the state where I can be a philosopher merely by sitting in a chair and thinking about things, rather than going out into the world and doing things. Like, actual philosophy is a heroic task. I think Nietzsche was such a tragic figure because he really wanted to be this heroic figure. He wanted to be a Zarathustra, but he had so many physical debilitations, you know, so many infirmities, that he couldn't live up to that. And I think that's sort of a hidden blessing or curse for Nietzsche too. But
it's almost like a Mishima. Sun and Steel. That's kind of
Mishima's sort of the last philosopher in this sense. Yes,
that was what struck me so hard about his Sun and Steel book. Is you look around and you see these everyday humans with their muscles that they've gotten through individuality through their lives. Like, this is how their bodies look through their lives, and he realized that why do all the Greek sculptures of gods look like bodybuilders? Yeah. Because that's the collectivized version of the best a human can be.
Yes.
And instead of, he was so embarrassed that he spent all these years writing these novels that won all these awards, and when he could have just been building himself into a god, or at least mimicking by action, by doing more than sitting down and looking at a pencil and writing, by working out and by developing his muscles and pushing himself as far as he could. And we see what that got him, though. He ended up killing himself because there's no other way to heroically die in this world. Yeah. You take that thought too far, I guess that's where you end up. But
it's interesting here. I mean, there's not really much historical stuff on this, but by most accounts, Plato was a very muscular, wrestling sort of type. Socrates was known to be incredibly endurant. He could outdrink anyone. He could stand in freezing cold, but he wasn't understood as being particularly muscular. It's interesting that in all accounts, Socrates is sort of the inverse of the ideal man, physically speaking. And Alcibiades points this out in Greek culture. And yet he would outdo everyone in these tasks of courage or these tasks of strength and endurance. Not raw strength, like just lifting a really heavy object, but actually enduring pain, right? There's almost this idea that the inner secret of Socrates is disfiguring yourself and playing a fool, both in terms of philosophy and in terms of your actual outer body, in order to, I guess there's two operations here. There's the Mishima way, which is perfection of the outer body to perfect the inner.
Yeah.
And then there's a Socratic irony way, which is the perfection of the inner to the destruction of the outer. And what Socrates is really doing in this way is that he's getting his experience by being a people person. He's a cosmopolitan. He's a socialite in the highest order of that. And it's being someone who's in the city square, which we don't really have an analogy in modernity. We don't really have an agora where people, the closest thing would be something ridiculous like Kroger, right?
Yeah.
We don't really have a place. I mean, when I was in New York City, there was places like this, like Union Square. I would go there. There would be some blonde, blue-eyed guy spouting Nazi propaganda. There'd be someone spouting KJV onlyism. There'd be a Calvinist. I had a Jewish mystic friend there, an Islamic mystic friend, a Franciscan who would preach. And it was, and all these philosophies, atheist and materialist, all sort of going there and talking. And I was like, this is such a rare phenomenon in the modern West. And I really treasured that. I mean, New York City is a terrible place, but that was one thing that really shined out about it. And, since COVID broke out, that has totally gone to the wayside. So it's like any of those spaces that have existed in the past decade or so are probably entirely destroyed now. But
there's a famous, or almost famous, don't know how famous the book is, but I recently read the book, The Death of the Gods, and it's on a series. It's 3 books. Evelyn said it was the book that had the most profound effect on him. Joseph Campbell said that. Freud said that. These books have
Sorry, which book?
I don't remember it's like the series is maybe the Christ and the Antichrist, but the first book is The Death of the Gods. The second book's about Da Vinci. Third book's about Peter the Great. It's written in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But in the book Death of the Gods is about Julian the Apostate. He tries to, not so much suffocate Christianity, but bring back, Neoplatonism. Because his teacher was Iamblichus. Mm-hmm. What he does is, one of the first things he does is he invites all the heretics that the Christian government had kicked out.
Yes.
It's like Gnostics and pagans and Neoplatonists and Hermeticists and all these guys. He brings them all back into the square and allows them to argue. He just wants them to argue, and it ends up creating so much chaos. It's a great scene. Yeah, but that's what it reminded me of.
I have a real soft spot for Julian. There's a really great novel that's, as best as it can be, historical by Vidal. On Julian, just called Julian. It's really,
I think I've
really
heard
good.
of it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great read. I gave that to my priest. He loved it. But I admire so much of Julian because his strategy was dealing with the Christ not as this enemy who has to be repressed, but someone who, if he preaches truth, simply let truth out and see which line is the stronger. And that's, if you want to do democracy, if you want to do this sort of liberalism in the classical sense, that's the way to do it. It's to, let the form of ideas occur in a most free state, which is the exact opposite of what we do now. But through propaganda and whatnot. But I admire so much about Julian because of his approach. And he understood in a Freudian sense, the return of the repressed, that danger. You don't want to go about killing all the Christians. That just makes it worse. You have to actually let philosophy rule.
It's very Jordan Peterson-esque of you.
Maybe, yeah. Well, right. I'm not saying I hold this position, but I'm saying insofar you want to be a liberal, this is the way to do it.
No, I know. I'm just giving you a hard time. No, I agree. What's interesting is going back to morals. That's Plotinus' main problem with the Gnostics in his book, his treatise against the Gnostics, is that your God is evil. Mm-hmm. A God can't be good or evil. That doesn't make any sense for the highest being to be good or evil. Porphyry, Plotinus' student, in his treatise against the Christians, has the same argument. Like, how is your God good? Your God can't be good and have an evil enemy and it be a God.
Yeah.
With that said, I want to tell you a crazy story because it fits into this, and you might, I don't know what you're going to think about this. So this a friend of mine he's Protestant, but not in any, obviously his experience of life is different from any kind of doctrine in Protestantism or any version of Christianity for that matter. He sat me down the other day randomly and he says, this world is not the real world. I said, what do you mean? He said, there's a realm above this world. I see it that controls this world. I see it every day. I see it and he's a manager at a restaurant. He said, I fired someone because they came in the door. Another manager hired him. And I said, she has evil tainted all over her. He said, this whole world is full of demonic entities leading people downward. He's like, I've been 100% in my predictions of people growing up. I can see them, literally see this other realm affecting their lives. And it controls their behaviors. It controls everything. I said, well, so is this a moral thing? Is this about morals? He was like, I don't know. I think so. But all I know is that I see this realm and I see these entities, and there are some good ones, but they're primarily evil. And I watch them affect everyone's life differently. And I can tell you what almost every person I meet what the sin is by the entities that are around them. Okay, now that sounds like Jakob Burma. It sounds like or Swedenborg, almost like and he saw it as a curse.
Yeah.
He saw it as like, this is the worst, he's like, I said, man, I would love to have that experience. He's like, no, you don't. My life is hell because of this. Everyone I meet, I can almost tell you what's going to happen in their lives. Yeah. So taking that story into the context that morals are all arbitrary, how does this work?
Well, I think it goes back to if you do causes and effects enough, there's habituation. It's kind of like Aristotle. And there are effects that happen in our time space that are linear of cause and effect. But once you go to the higher dimensions, there are effects that happen in what would appear from our point of view to be retroactive or back in time. So there is inertia, both forward and backward and up and down in the above realms. And what you're seeing is cause and effect. It's habituation of these spirits, but you're seeing that effect and that energy in all directions, not just from present to future or from present to past, the way we typically think of things. In the spiritual eye, the spiritual sense, you not only gain apprehension in many cases of the other realms. I grew up with people who had this similar ability, but you gain apprehension of the cause and effect in these different spiritual, because the spiritual essence or life force, it doesn't really operate in the immediate linear sense we're used to.
Of course, yeah.
So you are still witnessing cause and effect. It's not, we term that, again, we assign names like good and evil, but what we're really describing is habituations. And people, it's kind of like Aquinas says with the planetary bodies. Astrological influences are inevitable. You can, if you wish, transcend them, but that is basically being a saint. Right? So you have all these spirits, like St. Anthony being tormented by the demons and his total stoicism, right? Or when you read Jesus in the Gospels, you have such an intense stoic idea of a man, right? Is that there's all these things happening to us constantly, especially Jesus, who was basically every single demon in hell was against him. But there is a heroic aspect to which you transcend that. But that's very, very rare. It's the same thing with free will, right? Like, yes, there is a way that you can act as a free agent, but that's very, very, very hard to get to. You have what you're eating affecting you. Tell me what you are, I'll tell you what you eat. That's Savarine. You have demons affecting you. You have neutral spirits affecting you. You have sunlight affecting you. You have your work affecting you. You have your family. You have all these psychoanalytic problems affecting you. You have the planetary bodies affecting you. You have to conquer all those things. The heroic task of Hercules to even begin to start on something like free will. And it does exist, but it's heroic. So when you have people with that gift where they're looking into the spiritual realm, they're seeing even then only the tip of the iceberg of some of these effects.
Yeah. That's kind of how I took that, is that, it's they're playing around in the hierarchy of the Kabbalists. They're playing around in the level right above us without being able to see the level above that and the level above that.
Exactly, yeah.
And that's kind of how I took it. I just thought it was utterly fascinating because he had no words for it. Like I was saying, so that's like a causal realm. He's like, oh, yes, that's exactly a good way to put it. Like he had no education in this at all.
Yeah, he was the Mino.
It's just like, this is what I was, it was an interesting, fascinating conversation. But he's some of his predictions that I know about, which is only a few, have been accurate. Like it's crazy.
Yeah, when I was in high school, I had a friend who was a witch, and she grew up with a Satanist family. And I guess because of that, or maybe not, I don't know, she would see these things, like these spirits. And she called them shadow people, which other people have a term for. I think she just read that online. She's like, this is what they are. And I brought her to this Protestant camp I had friends at, just out of interest. It was called Young Life. And it was like, it's very like curated. It's very nice grass. It's very Protestant. And it was kind of fun because, you could just play Frisbee or whatever. But at night, she said when we got there, I want to see her reaction. I was like, because, she always sees these spirits. And I was like, I wonder what she would see in this place. And she said it was remarkable because she didn't see any of these spirits. And I was like, well, that's interesting. That's not exactly what I expected. But then she said, it was surrounded by woods. And she said there were spirits in the woods. But then at night, they would do these coming to Jesus moments in the main hall. And, Cry nights, yes. And they would play, it was so weird to me. I was like, this is the weirdest thing I've ever done in my life. They would have they would start it with Justin Bieber, Miley Cyrus songs. And then they would have these young adults come out and be like, oh, I was a sinner and then I turned to Christ. And she would not go anywhere near the place when that was happening. And I would hang out with her in the woods because she felt safer in the woods. Like she would entirely leave the campus. And eventually, after 3 nights of this, people were asking where we were. And I was like, well, we're going to the forest. And they asked why. And I was like, well, it's hard to explain. So I asked her, people are wondering, what's going on? Why are you? And she's like, well, the spirits I see. And I was like, yes. And you said they aren't here. She's like, well, they aren't. But at night, when they do all that, whatever they're doing in there, I see all these spirits fly down on top of the roof. And it's like they're sucking the energy out of it and they're getting bigger. And I was like, wow, that's interesting. And so later I was reading Seraphim Rose, I think it was Orthodox and Religion in the Future. And he was talking about how a lot of modern Christianity has basically turned into for lack of a better word, he doesn't use this word, but a drug rave party for demons. It's just such an intense Dionysian energy that has really little to do with Christianity or religion. It's pure spiritual masturbation. And the demons these spirits actually feed off of it.
Yeah,
they get
emotion.
They get a high.
It was emotion. Yeah. I grew up Pentecostal church. I know that the emotion gets so high, and I think it's Plotinus that says that any god that is making you emotional is a god from below.
Yeah. Yes.
The only thing
it's chthonic.
The only way that you can feel a God's presence is spiritual intuition.
Yes.
Is a spiritual gnosis.
Yes.
That's the only way how the highest God reveals Himself to you. And growing up in a Pentecostal church, it's all emotion. It's pump up emotion, pump it up.
It is growing up in America in general.
That's true.
Pentecostal is a very particular version of that. But even Catholicism, right? And which was, if you actually read old Catholics, before the 14th century especially, they're saying all this stuff is demonic. And now you just see it in such rapid emotionalism. I was like, the difference between what you get out of reading ancient Christians, or I should say classical Christians, and what Christianity is now are just two totally different religions.
Yeah. Well, and you see it just keeps going into the secular culture. Like I was talking before this podcast, that the wife made me sit there and watch all 8 Harry Potter movies over the last 2 weeks. And I've seen them before, at least most of them. But one of the things I found interesting is that it's very... The only thing that makes the Potter and the gang protagonists is your emotional attachment to them and your emotional sentimentality of right and wrong.
Yeah.
And we discussed this before. look at it from a higher perspective, Voldemort's in the right.
Yeah.
The way he's thinking, like he's exactly right. Like this magic is going down the tube. Let's return to tradition.
He has a very logical, rational, evidence-based view.
And the Pottern gang is all emotion. It's all like sentimentality. It's all, and that transcends to the secular world today with, you know, the SJWs. Everything they spew is just emotion. Or it's based in emotion. Everything. It's like this. That's like what Evelyn was saying. The farther you get away from the source, the stupider the morals get, and the further away from any type of truth they get. And you know, this whole idea of tolerance. Tolerance is absurd. Tolerance is how you destroy your life. Discrimination is how you make your life better. That's logical. You know, but it's become a moral, you know?
Yeah, and I think something I would add ultimately here too is that in the same way you have to go beyond good and evil, you also have to go beyond the dichotomy of even emotion and logic, because the absolute higher truth that things are noetic. They're not ultimately deductible or inductible through logical, rational means. That being said, in the hierarchy of approaching that state to begin with, you have to put emotion as a slave to reason. I think emotion has importance because it clues you in on things. It's like your gut. Saying like there's something iffy going. It's not a spiritual intuition necessarily, that they might overlap sometimes, but it is helpful to be in tune with emotion only insofar you can be like, okay, let's process this with the mastermind and the nous. And if you have a spiritual state, I mean, what you get out of reading the Church Fathers is that you come to a point in the spiritual alchemical work where you don't even need reason, you don't even need emotion anymore. You're totally noetic. You don't rely on the physical world to manifest knowledge. You simply have knowledge by mere participation in logos. And you see something similar in esoteric works or chemical works or philosophical works where you ultimately transcend those modes of knowledge. And there's something etymologically interesting here in the Greek with pistis and epistemology. Pistis sort of being trust, or what we might understand as faith. Epistemology being knowledge, understanding of the world. All knowledge ultimately begins with faith. All knowledge begins with trust. And this is something I'm very critical of with modernity, which is this idea that we sort of have this deus ex machina with knowledge. We have this knowledge out of nothing. Like there's this, might be scientific knowledge or whatever CNN is telling you or whatever, you know, something ridiculous. But it's as if there's like this knowledge that just sort of stands independently. And as Nietzsche shows, there's always a foundation that can crumble. And there is no absolute true knowledge. There's merely what you have put faith in. There's a trust. And the question you have to ask yourself in doing these things is, where are you putting your faith? Where are you putting your trust? What gods are you worshiping? And I think at the end of the day, it's kind of like what Paul says, like most people worship their stomach. They worship their immediate emotional desires. And they don't understand that that desire itself is a corrupted desire. And again, you don't want to go the totally other opposite direction of pure stoicism, which isn't even true stoicism. It's a perversion of stoicism, where it's just pure reason, pure logic, right? But you do want to understand that and so far there's something there. It's there for a reason. It's cluing you in on something, but it also has to be enslaved. You have to make it your bitch. You have to be the master of emotion.
Well, Gurdjieff, his whole thing is, like I said, you have these three brains, and one's emotion, one's thinking, one might be sensation. I don't recall, but the whole point is, his whole method is to destroy all three. Mm-hmm. And there's a very succinct way he does this, really interesting. You destroy all three. You take them down to nothing, where you have no attention left in feeling, thinking, anything. Yeah. And once you do that, they all get down to the baseline, the foundation of zero, where then you get to sync them together. But you have to have all three to reach this higher level. But they have to all be in even proportion. One can't be higher than the other. And he says the modern man, the thinking function tries to, we put that so high by ignoring the other functions. Yeah. And you're saying about what you see, what you eat. There's three types of food. There's regular food, there's the air you breathe, and there's the sensations you take in that determine a person's life.
You have 1 minute. Okay. Do you have any closing statements, Jonathan?
There's so many other questions we can go down with this. I mean, it just keeps going.
We can always do a sequel.
But we probably should. Because the one question I want to ask is, at what point, what about pedophiles? Mm-hmm. Because it's going to end there, because if you keep thinking about, okay, well, there's no morals, then what's the worst question you could ask?
Yeah. And it historically wasn't such an alarming thing as it is to us now. And I think that's interesting in itself. I think that there's something Freudian here too, insofar that the more you exorcise what is evil or what is bad, the more whatever remains has to be made the totality of evil. So and I think there's something politically speaking in pedophilia of some sort of power dynamic that it's deeper than disgust, because obviously like disgust really doesn't have much play in what is moral nowadays, right? So people were like, oh, pedophilia is disgusting, but I'm not convinced that's ultimately why people find it immoral. There's something deeper about that power dynamic that, again, speaking Freudianly, it's not that people have pedophilia desires and therefore they're externalizing it, but people have this intense desire to dominate others. And it's sort of like the same reason people hate Trump, I think. They see such a will to power, not by any means to support him, but they see such a will to power in an individual. Like Trump is sort of like this lightning rod phallus of the id of Americans. And he attracts all these things that especially people on the left have in their shadow that they don't want to admit.
That's a good point.
I think there's something in pedophilia similar where it's like people have this intense desire to dominate over innocent people that they don't like, that they resent. And they externalize that in an easy target, which is pedophilia. So I think there's something going on there. But I think very much so you could see moralism as a whole seed to this problem to begin with. But
that's where I would have taken the conversation too. But we'll to be continued this one.
Okay. Well, all I say is be good, but don't be too good.